Welcome to the Quality Talks podcast. I'm in Kugler host, and my guest today is Jerry Chapman. Jerry is a senior GMP quality expert at Redica Systems. He has been in the industry since 1978. And this is my second part of my talk with him about things that don't change in pharma. And today we're going to talk about technology, why it's not changing, and where it is heading with several examples from what Jerry does at Redica Systems. And it has to do with FDA findings and how systems, AI, and automation can help with it to prevent it and to improve the quality at pharma organizations. Before we get to our talk with Jerry, I want to remind you that Qualister is now a knowledge provider. If you go to www.qualister.com, you will find a social Q&A engine. You can ask their questions about GMP, get answers from experts around the world, or you can also contribute to the questions of others by answering them and sharing your knowledge with them. And you will also gain points and credibility and a good feeling for that. So please go to www.quality.com and check it out. And now let's get to our talk with Jerry.
So, Jerry, you have been in the pharmaceutical industry for quite a while now. So, what is your opinion on the digital progression in the pharmaceutical manufacturing throughout the years and in comparison to other industries?
The issue has always been what we call post-approval changes. Once you have registered a process, then making any changes in that process is difficult. I was in biosynthetic insulin manufacturing, and we made what was a really important discovery in a way that we could make our process much more efficient, and it would translate into a much more cost-effective product, and a cheaper product for the consumers. But it was going to take years to implement it. We could implement it in the plant in 6 months, but couldn't get the regulatory approval. So we'd have to have get the regulatory approval in stages, right? So this country will approve it in a year. In this country, it's going to take 3 years. This country is probably going to take 4 years. And so in the meantime, you have all these different inventories that you need to manage, right? So this was made with method A, and we can sell it here. This is made in method B, we can sell it here. Method C goes over here, and you manage that over years, and it's a nightmare. So that has been a real issue with looking at advanced technologies and upgrading manufacturing processes. And if you look at other industries that are also highly regulated, they have managed to upgrade their technologies. Now, if you'll talk to FDA, for example, there was a presentation done recently where FDA was talking about their advanced manufacturing technology teams. They have a lot of efforts underway that can help companies come in and register new technologies. And there's been some work recently. So ICHQ 12 is out now on lifecycle management and post-approval changes. And I think that's going to help. So that's a recent effort that is helping something that we've been dealing with for decades. But there are still issues. There are still issues with established conditions and what does that mean? Q12 has some annexes with examples. Those are really helpful. FDA has some examples as they are working to implement it as well, but it's still problematic. So that's one of those things that has changed some, but not a lot. It's still very problematic.
Can you give a bit of examples or some overview of what Q12 tries to resolve and how it does it?
Yeah, so Q12 was trying to reduce cost and time burdens on industry and support continual improvement. So it's trying to do that by looking at post-approval changes and coming up with some common definitions of different types of post-approval changes. So if it's a minor change or if it's a major change, how do you categorize that, and what are the requirements that need to be submitted for that? And it's being implemented in the U.S. and in the EU. But colleagues I've talked to in the industry have said that it may help some, but there's still a long way to go.
So, in your opinion, what actually holds us back from implementing new technologies? So, is it really regulations or is it something else? Because there are many people with whom I talk that say that blaming it on regulations is just laziness or just foolishness, because you can always find a solution if you really want to implement a new technology and if you see the value of it.
I can see it from both sides. I mean, I understand that making post-approval changes is difficult, it's costly, but I have to agree that just blaming it on regulations is a little lazy. FDA, for example, has a number of teams. CEDAR and CBER, they have their advanced technologies team, emerging technologies program, where companies can go and sit down and say, we have this new technology, we want to implement it. Help show us how we can do this without all the regulatory burden. And there are teams in place that will help do that, right? So those efforts are out there, but I think there's just the feeling so much of what we do, not just in this industry, but just in life, has to do with our previous experiences. And there's this feeling, in pharma, in the pharma industry, that, oh, these changes are so hard to make, and so people a lot of times get locked into that kind of a mental attitude, and don't really explore what the possibilities are.
So do you think that the reason for that can be also that quality personnel don't understand or don't know how to convey the cost of quality to the management to say, okay, we should implement this system because it will help us save time, save money.
That is certainly part of the issue, and it's one of those issues that has been around, I think, the entire time that I have been in the industry, and that is that it's hard to measure not having a problem. It's easy to measure how much you saved. We have this problem. You write in as the Lone Ranger, you fix it, and you write out, "Wow, you're a hero," right? But what if we didn't have the problem to begin with? How do we convince management that we need to be more proactive? And it's hard. It's hard to measure and put a cost around preventing problems.
Right, right.
And that's been an issue for a long time.
Brings us to the same thing which we talked about when we talked about the training part. When you started, you said, okay, we are really reactive, right? So how do we become more proactive with our approach? So we know that FDA really goes into the risk management, so they try to push the companies to be more proactive in calculating the risks and applying the right processes and the right methods and the right systems and the right technologies in order to stop problems. And I think we will get there. But I think, again, we come to the training and the education of the quality personnel to think about quality also in terms of money, and to know how to translate it, how to take some issue and come to the manager and say, okay, we have 30% or 20% that this issue cures, but it will cost us that and that sum of millions of dollars, or this will cause us a closure of the plan because of a warning letter. It will happen 10%, but it will be devastating, right? So maybe
Mhm.
this should be part of the education of such personnel, also quality in Six Sigma tools, for example.
That makes sense.
And if we are talking about technologies, right? So pharma, I always say it feels like it's always a bit behind in the manufacturing, in the processes, because we always the pharma doesn't use the latest tools that are there, because it's a bit difficult to validate them. like we said, or to convince the management that we need the new tools, right? So where are we now in the technology, and where should we be?
That's a very broad and interesting question. I would say that, and this is a story. Actually, this is an analogy that a colleague of mine used recently that I'll use, and maybe it's illustrative. You have a new phone. You have a cell phone. It's probably fairly new, right? We all do, right? We get a new phone on average, every 2 years or every year, right? We get an upgrade and get a new phone. Why is that? Does it do anything any differently? It's still a phone, right? It still gets you an internet browser, right? It probably has the same apps, okay? But maybe it's a little thinner, or maybe it's a little smaller screen, or maybe it's a little bigger screen, right? And so it's so much about the user experience instead of just what it does, how better it makes our operations, or how much more, what is the user experience with that versus what it was, with the old phone. So we have a tendency to upgrade for certain reasons in some areas of our lives, and in other areas of our lives we just don't, right?
Right.
And so I think that's kind of part of the discussion that we could have.
Exactly. So I think that again with the phones, in some of the upgrades of the software or the hardware, it's more emotional, or you want to show your friends that you have the new iPhone or you have this or that, but it doesn't bring you much value. But on the other side, every few years there is some breakthrough in technology. For example, with the NFC, that you can just pay with your credit card without having your credit card on you. Just put the phone to it, or you have better cameras, and so on and so on. But I think the main thing is the user experience. What you mentioned, it was the breakthrough of the smartphones, right? So it is so intuitive that you knew how to use it. When you switch from the buttons to the smartphone, you instantly you knew how to use it, because it's so simple, and it's not and it feels right, just to use your fingers to control it. And I think that so many of the programs that we have in pharma are so complicated, and it takes so long to learn them, to master them, and it takes a lot of time, and it also produces errors because it is complicated. And I think that there are companies that are trying to solve that, to make it making better QMS, easier QMS, which brings everything together and in one system. But do you think this is the issue, that companies should more companies should create software that is better for pharma? So software companies should understand that pharma is a good market for it, and they should start creating good user interfaces for pharma, because there is money there. And from the other side, the pharma should understand, okay, I know we worked 20 years with this software, but maybe it's time to upgrade.
Something that I have a passion around, having to do with software and using modern tools in the pharma industry. Part of my theme here has been reflecting on what has changed and what hasn't changed in the industry over the 40 plus years that I've been in the industry. And one thing that hasn't changed is the way that we analyze agency expectations. So FDA puts out regulations, and the regulations, in the CFR are written very broadly, right? They're written very broadly. They're subject to a fair amount of interpretation. We hope that we interpret them the same way that FDA interprets them when they come in. Um, and so kind of what we have done over the years, and what I have done, is we would say, okay, here's what's written, but what are they actually looking for? How do we find out what they actually expect? And the way that we do that is by looking at enforcement actions, right? So we look at 483s, we look at warning letters that have been given to other companies, and we sit down and read through those and look through those and say, Here's what they really expected. Here's what they found. Here are the areas we should be focusing on. But what has happened that over time is that we have a lot more agencies that are coming in to inspect, for instance. Um, and there's just a lot more proliferation of guidance and regulation. It makes it difficult to keep up. So what we would do in the past, what I have done, and I know a lot of people in the past, when we got hold of a 483 from a company that had a similar product, for example, to what we were marketing, we would take the 483 and sit down, and an expert, someone with a lot of experience uh, in the industry and in those technologies, would sit down with a highlighter and have a hard copy, print the hard copy, and go through with a highlighter, right? And say, this is important, this is important. They cited this, but look what they said here. This is kind of important. They didn't specifically cite this, but it's obvious that they thought it was an issue. And go through and highlight that. And um, so what has happened over time is that people still do that, right? They're still doing that today. But so for example, where I work at Redica Systems, we have developed a system where we can analyze those enforcement actions with a computer algorithm using natural language processing and artificial intelligence tools, and produce the same kind of an analysis as an expert would, but no hard copy, no highlighter, right? Um, and um, and so we can go through those documents and look. And what we find is that we can find what we're calling observations hiding in plain sight. Okay, so the algorithm is trained to look for sequences of words that we call n-grams. And it also uses turbo EIR text from FDA 483s. And then we have what we call these natural language processing tools. We have the ability to do that, to go in and find out what some of those hidden issues are. And I actually talked with a friend of mine who, they probably shouldn't mention his name, but he worked for FDA for about 30 years and then recently left. He is now the senior VP of quality and compliance at a major pharma company based in Europe, actually. And I was explaining to him what we were doing and how this tool was working with 483s and warning letters. And he said that's exactly the way that I used to write warning letters. And that's the way that I taught my staff. When I left, taught people who were going to be writing, this is how you write a warning letter. What bubbles up to a CFR citation is really, it's important. But again, the CFR is broad enough that it can encompass a lot of things, right? So what else? What is it specifically talking about? So you've got the CFR citation, but down below you've got this other text that says, for example, what he told me, he said, so that's where we would say, okay, this didn't bubble up to a CFR site, but this was important and we saw this and you really should look at this. He said, so it's written in a fairly subtle way, but an expert with a highlighter can go through and find that. So if you don't have experts with highlighters on your team, or you don't have the tools, that we have built, we have those tools that are available to go through and do that kind of analysis.
So that's quite interesting, so AI is moving into really interesting directions, and automation tools that save time instead of an expert that sits and highlights some issues which he may or may not interpret correctly. But you're talking about a system that when somebody programmed it, he went through dozens of letters and found out uh, the similarities, the differences, and understood what is behind the words when they writes it, and what are the consequences. So that's a really interesting way to use automation and tools. to really help your company to move quicker by using some different services. And what are your thoughts on that in general? Where are we moving? So you said it's a great way. Your tools are a great way to understand the deficiencies which agencies come with and the irregularities behind it and what it really means. What do you think is the future here? What else can be done which we are doing manually, but we can delegate it to a computer soon or later?
We can use similar kinds of algorithms and tools to look, for example, inside a company at the inspections that FDA performed within your company. Or we can look at inside your company, what are your auditors finding, right? So what are your internal auditors finding, and is that tracking with what FDA is finding, right? So from a compliance standpoint, there's certainly that. Also, as I mentioned, there's been such a huge proliferation over the last 10 or 20 years of new agencies outside the United States that come to that inspect, and they have a lot of them use the EU GMPs or the PICS GMPs, but not all of them. You've got the Organization of Southeast Asian States. You've got a lot of different inspectorates that have these slightly nuanced kinds of things that they're looking at. It's really hard to try to figure all that out and keep all that together. And so, in the past, we would have a human who would try to keep up with that, or we would have affiliates, right? And so you've got someone who talks, we're going to talk to our affiliate in China about this Chinese document, right? For instance. Um, and that's not a bad system, but I think that that's another area where we have started looking at using some computer software tools to help keep up and look at what's going on, what are the chain expectations, what are the changes that are happening compared to what the expectations were before. So there are a lot of ways, at least on the compliance standpoint and on the rules, regulations, and guidance kind of area, to keep up with those and keep up with the changes and link those to your internal documents and what changed externally and how does that map to what you need to change internally. So if there is a change in something, does that mean do you have to make a change to a corporate level procedure or policy, or and then how does that cascade down? So there are a lot of opportunities, and we actually have done a lot of work in that area at my company.
That's quite interesting. So automation of different thinking processes, right? So that's what you're talking about. So you're so usually when you do a change, you need to sit down and analyze it. How risky is the change to the process, to the quality? How will it impact the specific molecule or your critical parameters, right? And then you need to think about the regulatory issues. What steps do I need to take now, right? So if you had a software which already guides you through this process, it probably would be much easier. And then people in quality are more of analysts because they input the information and they read what comes out from it. So this is basically where we are heading to, in the technology side, that we are inputting information into a system, reading the output, and then making the final decisions.
Just keep in mind that for the scenario that you just outlined, that those because those systems are making GMP decisions, they have to be fully validated systems, and there will need to be human checks and balances in those systems as well.
Right, exactly. And then we are coming um, back to the point of having the guts, the bravery, the time, and the the passion to change. Jerry, thank you very much for your time and for speaking with me about those interesting topics.
Thank you for having me. I would enjoy speaking with you again.
Thanks for listening to the Qualitalks podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star review. If you want to learn more about GMP, please visit us at www.qualistery.com. Stay compliant and see you at the next one.